RI Unit Podcast.
Episode 8.
Professor Howard Nicholas. Bram Nicholas. With Roshan Madiwala. Discussion on China's manufacturing dominance and its implications for the developing world.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the RI Unit podcast series for 2025. Today, we're featuring Professor Howard Nicholas from the Erasmus University in the Netherlands, and also the founder of the Institute of Policy Studies in Colombo. A big welcome to you, Howard. And then we have Dr. Bram Nicholas, COO of ETIS and Associate Lecturer at the University of Economics at Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. A big thank you to you as well, Bram, for joining us from Vietnam. And Howard is in the Netherlands, I believe.
That's right. Suffering in the cold.
It should be summer by now. Yes.
You would think.
Yes, indeed. So today, again, we're going to be discussing an amazing list of subject matter, which I think is pertinent to what's going on. And let me just put some context into that. We're truly living in extraordinary times in the world at the moment. It's very difficult to guess what's going to happen next. We're also seeing an unmasking of the global powers, as it were, and a blatant duplicity in the application of a rules-based global order. Or so we were led to think that there was such a thing. And we're getting to see the way by which the other is treated, as opposed to the people who propagate such a global order. On the good side, we're seeing a consequential reawakening in the South, perhaps, of people like, President Abraham Traore and others who, along with many people in the global South, feel the cleavage between the mainstream Western media and the global South in general has widened to unprecedented levels. I think I haven't witnessed such a extreme difference, I don't think, in my lifetime. And we've also seen many things, amongst which I think most recently we've seen the real weakness of the Gulf states, their lack of power, their lack of integrity, and the fact that even a tiny country like the Maldives has shown to have more independence and more power, and perhaps their moral compass to be in the right place by demonstrating its independence as compared to these extremely rich countries who don't seem to have much room to move. It is said by many commentators the reason is because they need the superpowers' help to survive against their own people. We may touch on that. But one other good thing I'd like to say at the start is the G word, the genocide word, which we have been saying for more than 1.5 years now, is now to be heard in the Western media and even amongst politicians. The people who were propping up the apartheid state are now turning against it. And this reminds me, Howard and Bram, that we were discussing previously whether what happened in South Africa is something where collective, global people power work to dismantle an apartheid state, whether that is something which we can expect in the coming years in this instance. We can keep our hopes up, but I feel it's also a very dangerous time. Will such a state go quietly and allow itself to be disintegrated? Or are we looking at a very dangerous moment? And in the context of very fluid changes in even the military powers of the world, where we've learned very recently that military spend does not equal military capacity or effectiveness. So it's interesting. But what we're interested in as economists is how this is going to affect the emerging economies in particular, and South Asia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, and so on. So that seems like rather a lot to burden on our experts, but I'm sure they're capable. So I'll start with Howard. What is your take on the global situation as it's evolving right now? I didn't mention the India-Pakistan war because that's a whole new Pandora's box. But generally, if you can just address the trend that we've seen in the last year or so and how you see that moving forward. Is it a very dangerous moment?
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for inviting me again. I go back to economics all the time, Roshan, and what I see, most of what we're seeing today is the manifestation of the rise of China. And I keep going back to that. It's been my hobby horse for actually a very long time. And I'm just back from China, in fact, where I've been teaching there and giving a number of guest lectures. And what I've observed over the years is even my Chinese audience don't get it. You know, they don't really see this dramatic change that has happened with China. And they don't understand fully what underlies that. And what underlies that is very simple. It's industrialization. It is the development of an incredible manufacturing powerhouse, China, today. And I think we should actually give credit to the Trump administration for understanding that base of power, and that is manufacturing. And actually even attempting to bring manufacturing back to the US. In order to fully appreciate this, it would be good for us to go through the rise of China. But before that, perhaps, Brahm, you had a very short clip from J.D. Vance acknowledging and understanding the importance of manufacturing and bringing manufacturing back to the US in order to stop the erosion of US power.
Yeah, I thought that was a really one of the more interesting videos that we saw. I think it came out just before Trump launched the whole tariff war on the world. And since then, there's been a lot of confusion, right? I mean, it started off with this narrative of bringing manufacturing back to the US. But then other things were thrown in, like wanting to solve the trade deficit that the US has, and something to do with the dollar as world money and whether it should be stronger or weaker. But then I found this video where his vice president, J.D. Vance, is, I mean, basically saying what you've been saying, is this emphasis on manufacturing, and especially technological development related to that, how that's been forgotten as such an important driver in any economy. But so, yeah, I think, let me share that one now.
Because there were two conceits that our leadership class had when it came to globalization. The first is assuming that we can separate the making of things from the design of things. The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone box and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. Now the implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen or somewhere else. And yeah, some people might lose their jobs in manufacturing, but they could learn to design, or to use a very popular phrase, learn to code. But I think we got it wrong. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things. There are network effects, as you all well understand. The firms that design products work with firms that manufacture. They share intellectual property, they share best practices, and they even sometimes share critical employees. Now, we assume that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but it turns out that as they got better at the low end of the value chain, they also started catching up on the higher end. We were squeezed from both ends. Now, that was the first conceit of globalization. I think the second is that cheap labor is fundamentally a crutch, and it's a crutch that inhibits innovation. I might even say that it's a drug that too many American firms got addicted to. Now, if you can make a product more cheaply, it's far too easy to do that rather than to innovate. And whether we were offshoring factories to cheap labor economies or importing cheap labor through our immigration system, cheap labor became the drug of Western economies. And I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. And I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct. Now, one of the debates you hear on the minimum wage, for instance, is that increases in the minimum wage force firms to automate. So a higher wage at McDonald's means more kiosks. And whatever your views on the wisdom of the minimum wage, I'm not going to comment on that here. Companies innovating in the absence of cheap labor is a good thing. I think most of you are not worried about getting cheaper and cheaper labor. You're worried about innovating, about building new things, about the old formulation of technology is doing more with less. You guys are all trying to do more with less every single day. And so I'd ask my friends, both on the tech optimist side and on the populist side, not to see the failure of the logic of globalization as a failure of innovation. Indeed, I'd say that globalization's hunger for cheap labor is a problem precisely because it's been bad for innovation. Both our working people, our populists, and our innovators gathered here today have the same enemy. And the solution, I believe, is American innovation.
I mean, the interesting thing for me here, and I think you recognize this as well immediately, Howard, is what's underlying almost everything he says is that he and the Trump administration have now fully abandoned the neoliberal model, because we're talking of a minimum wage. We're talking of putting up tariffs and other protectionist measures to interfere essentially with free markets, and that is a necessary thing for the US economy to improve and do better. And I just thought that was such a fascinating thing that we've now sort of rolled into, where I think nobody really realizes or remembers that, like 20 years ago, it was still unthinkable that a US government would come along and basically not adhere to any neoliberal policies anymore, and essentially say, no, actually, we have to interfere with markets now if we want to revive the US economy.
I think another aspect of that, Bram, which has now come out, is the importance again of manufacturing. I mean, I keep repeating this, but for a very, very long time, whenever we've discussed economic growth, everyone has dismissed manufacturing, except for a few, let's say, on the fringes of the economic academia. Everyone has actually dismissed this. Now manufacturing has come to the center. But what I want to say is, if you look at, and here it would be useful to look at that slide showing the rise of China. If you look at China's dominance of global manufacturing, and we have a very nice slide for that. What you actually...
Because there were...
Sorry about that.
What you actually should understand is this pattern is just a repeat of every country that has come to dominate the global economy. The very first country to dominate was the UK, and it basically dominated global manufacturing. Other countries were insignificant in the 19th century. Everything was about the UK. By the late 19th century, a new power emerged in manufacturing, and that was the US. Now, what is interesting there is that the rise of the US was actually not seen by the world. It was certainly not seen by the UK. Let's say 1880s, when the US actually overtook Britain in terms of world manufacturing share, British economists, British administrators didn't fully appreciate that the US had now taken over the driving seat of the world economy. They still believed they were in the driving seat. Fast forward to China and China's rise. Actually, China, by 2008, China had overtaken all the other manufacturing powerhouses. Currently, China accounts for the same amount of global manufacturing as the US and EU put together. But until recently, this was not recognized. China's dominance of the global economy was not fully recognized. The extent of that dominance is manifest in China's share of global trade. If you look at China's share of global trade, I think it is the dominant partner for about 80% of the globe. And if you compare that with 2000, so look at 2000, compare that with 2020, in 2000, it wasn't that dominant. But fast forward today, it's dominant for two reasons. One is because it's the largest manufacturer in the world. Most countries are taking Chinese exports. But of course, to make those manufactures, it needs all the raw materials that are being produced in the world, or the largest share. And so China actually dominates the global raw material production. And it accounts for at least 40% of most metals used in manufacturing production. So where China goes, basically, most of the raw material producers go. So if China has a recession, those countries also have a recession. But in fact, we see that it's not just the raw material producers that have a recession, but it's also the countries where China is so important in providing manufacturing inputs. And the most obvious manifestation of this is a chart that we have from the OECD. Now, I say this chart is extremely important because until recently, people didn't get it. I had a PhD student who provided this chart as part of her PhD. And two very senior international economists didn't believe it. They didn't believe that China was so important in the world economy until they actually went and checked the data. They checked the source of this data. And one of the two wrote me a letter of apology saying, I'm really sorry, because they nearly failed her. since she said, actually, the country that dominates the global business cycle is China. And these are two very prominent economists. They didn't actually know this. And I'm talking about 2018. And this actually has not been understood by a large majority of the economics fraternity. They still believe that the US and EU are at the center of the dynamism of the global economy. But it's not true. It's not true. Where China goes, the global economy goes. And we'll come back to that later. The reason why the global economy has been resilient, even in the face of Trump's tariffs, is because China has entered a stage of recovery in its business cycle. And it's actually pulling the rest of the world up. But once it reaches that peak and starts to head down, no matter what the US is doing and what Europe is doing, there'll be serious downward pressures in the global economy. This is how important China is. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Bram?
No, well, I mean, it's basically what we used ourselves to predict the last two downturns in global equity markets. And the funny thing is, if you look at a lot of financial market blogs and like mainstream outlets like Reuters and Bloomberg, there's never that type of analysis where people are watching what China is doing, and especially China's manufacturing sector, to predict what's going to happen to the global economy. It's always this sort of shock analysis, you know, where, oh, the Ukraine war shock, or, oh, now we have a tariff war shock. And I mean, then it's already too late. Then we see, you know, an immediate fall in global equity prices. But whereas if you had actually been watching the Chinese business cycle, this was a really useful predictor for what was going to happen to the global economy and global equities by implication. So, I mean, that was for us a key change in the way that we actually started examining the global economy and global equity markets.
Now, sorry, I was going to ask now, that's quite a scary thought that Howard has put forward, that perhaps there's a serious downturn with China at some point, which can have very serious repercussions for the whole world, which I think your diagrams have demonstrated that it's real in terms of the impact, whereas it's not the US any longer. But given what we read about China's involvement in the African states, economic engagement, which I think is helping to shift the old guard, the Francophone African states, etc., are losing influence to primarily because of a better deal with China, I think. Do you feel that because of the presence of new frontier markets that China is engaging with as part of its, Silk Road Initiative, Belt and Silk Road, then we will not hopefully see that downturn that you spoke of for, well, not anytime soon anyway. Would you agree with that? Or do you feel that that's something which is real?
Actually, I was going to come to that, Roshan. You have pushed me ahead.
Let's get back to
no, but it's a very important point, yeah. And it's important to come back to after we look at a driving force behind China's manufacturing rise, because it actually speaks to something that Vance said about innovation. how manufacturing process itself leads to the innovation. And so when you outsource it, what you're actually doing is outsourcing innovation. So he and a lot of other politicians in the West have finally understood that it is that manufacturing base that China dominates, which allows it to dominate innovation. Now, there again, my trip to China was very interesting because when I gave these various presentations, and I've also been teaching in Nanjing University, what I find incredible is how amazed the students and my audience were about China's technological advances. And I gave them one very important statistic, and Bram, you have that very interesting study done by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, just to actually summarize literally how far advanced China has gotten. They look at who dominates what they call 64 critical technologies. And there you have that list: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, robotics, computing, cyber, advanced materials, etc. Okay, that's the list included in their 64 critical technologies. Now, when they looked at the period 2003 to 2007, they saw that the US dominated 57 of those 64 critical technologies. If you fast forward to 2018 to 2022, who dominates? It's China. 52 of the 64. 52 of the 64. So who dominates global technology is actually China. And when we saw entities like DeepSeek coming out, this shocked the world, but it also shocked a lot of Chinese public because they had no idea that technology was so advanced in China. I'm talking to Chinese people also in business, and they actually didn't know. They know their area of technical expertise, but they didn't know the broader picture. And I think this is also something that the Chinese have consistently downplayed. We saw another example of their technological advancement in the recent conflict between India and Pakistan. When Pakistan fighter planes, basically destroyed NATO fighter planes, which were given to India. And the question is, how did they do that? Answer is they're technologically far more sophisticated. And when we realize
because the Pakistan planes were from China.
Pakistan planes were from China, and just remember, the Chinese are not going to give Pakistan their most advanced planes. These are probably at least 1 or 2 generations earlier.
I think they're called the J-10s, which...
J-10, exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. And
which defeated the Mirage from France, right? Which the Indians had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And now we are understanding that the Chinese drone technology is literally light years ahead of anything that the West has. So like this, we see slowly, the full extent of the technological leap that the Chinese have taken vis-a-vis the West. Now, there, you see what Van said is perfectly correct. Where manufacturing goes, innovation goes. But the other part of what he said is not correct. That he called Chinese economy a low-wage economy, with lots of countries going to China because of the relatively low wages. In fact, that's also not true. They go to China because of the low costs And those low costs are not based on low wages, but actually technologically advanced manufacturing processes. And there, what you have to see is the incredible infiltration of Chinese manufacturing by robots. And it's going at such an incredible pace. I think last year, China installed more robots in their manufacturing factories than was installed in the whole of the rest of the world put together. And so what you have now in China, in terms of employees employed, they're now third on the global list. And, please note the size of the manufacturing labor force in China. To have this number of robots in relation to that labor force is quite astonishing. And the speed at which the robots are entering the manufacturing labor force in China is quite staggering. As I said, last year they installed more robots than the rest of the world put together, more robots in manufacturing industry than the rest of the world put together. And you can see the same automation is taking place in other sectors. Recently, I saw an incredible video on their automation of agricultural equipment, where it's actually quite dramatic what they're doing. When you see no human beings on tractors. And these tractors the same tractor can plow fields with entirely different equipment without having to change anything at all. The tractor does it automatically because it has been programmed to do everything automatically. They use drones for picking berries and fruit and vegetables and even now harvesting rice. You can see the drones are everywhere in Chinese agriculture. This is what is underlying this manufacturing dynamism, and that is something that I think the West is now paying a lot of attention to.
Well, and I think even though he didn't say it explicitly, that, it's no longer about cheap labor in China, implicitly, of course, this is what he's complaining about, right? Because he's saying that actually this has now become the philosophy of US companies who, for increasing their profit, have no longer relied on increasing productivity and innovating their products, but rather getting more and more cheap labor to work in their factories and companies. And he implies that China is actually going in the other direction, because he also recognizes that, look, it did start with cheap labor, and everyone thought that's how it's going to stay. They'll stay a cheap labor market, China and other Asian countries, and they won't move up the value chain, as he said. But they did, they definitely did, and now have surpassed the US in almost every metric that we can find. And I think the other thing there is, like you said, Howard, it's not just, the labor costs, but it's also things like infrastructure. And this is what essentially we're missing is, Trump is basically now, he comes with this tariff war and says, okay, this is going to solve the entire problem. Or rather that maybe together with the tax cuts that he's proposing. But meanwhile, economists like Joseph Stiglitz have also said this, I think, where if you think this is how China actually did what it did, you're mistaken. Because it wasn't just having protectionist measures and, subsidizing their companies in strategic areas. It was a whole barrage of other policies that allowed them to industrialize. Key component there was building infrastructure. And if you look at the infrastructure that China now has, it is light years beyond what the US has. And not only that, the US has a problem of having a lot of old infrastructure that is now crumbling, and they're having to repair, but repairs won't be enough. They need to actually modernize it. And this is another reason why companies are simply saying, look, you can offer all the tax incentives you want, and you can slap on tariffs wherever you want. But in the end, it's still going to be more costly for us to start producing in the US because your infrastructure is way too old. Your labor force is actually not skilled enough. Again, it's this illusion that it's just cheap labor in China. They are actually very skilled in all the proper areas that companies and especially manufacturers are looking for. And so even when now the alternative of India is discussed, as an alternative manufacturing hub to China, companies have come out and said, you must be joking, as if we can find that skilled labor force, that same skilled labor force in India, not to mention, again, the infrastructure problem and a lot of other factors that come into those decisions. But yeah, I think this is the problem that we now have when we analyze what Trump is doing. He and his vice president and some in his team might be right about the core problem, but the way that he's going about it, I think, is going to do very little, if not more damage.
I wanted to now address what Roshan asked a short while ago.
Finally.
Sorry about that, Roshan. It's what Trump and co are doing, and remember, this is a continuation of policies also adopted by the Democrats and the EU, is trying to prevent China accessing Western markets. They don't have the possibility of blocking China's access to raw materials, at least not in the way they had done in the past. For example, when they blocked Japan in the 1940s, and when they blocked Germany in the 1930s, their access to raw materials, because China basically preempted this possibility with its Road and Belt Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative, making sure that it had land and maritime access to raw materials, which were not easily interfered with by the advanced countries. But coming back to the point that you raised, they also have done a second thing, and that is they're starting to create markets of their own, independent of Western markets. In other words, they're creating their own ecosystem. Now, don't forget, after the Second World War, the US created its ecosystem. It created markets for its massive expansion of manufacturing. Those markets were basically Europe, Japan, Korea, and a small number of other markets like Australia and New Zealand. But it needed markets, it needed to raise living standards in a number of allied countries. Now, what China is doing is it's actually promoting industrialization, manufacturing, and a rise in living standards in its allied countries. And that's really what the second part of BRICS is really about. Because now they have countries like India, Brazil, Russia. These are not small economies. These are fairly substantial economies with substantial markets. But intriguingly, they're also trying to develop manufacturing in African countries. For example, South Africa. There's a lot of joint manufacturing production taking place between Chinese and South African producers. Ethiopia is another country where you see this happening. And you're actually starting to see it in a lot of African countries. And it makes sense because Chinese companies have been told they have to move out of China and do joint ventures. But equally, they need to create markets and diversify the markets away from the traditional advanced country markets. In other words, they're raising the living standards and creating those markets. And that's a very, very important development. It means to say that the US and Europe will be less and less important to this global dynamism. Because it's not only China, but it's also other countries, like a lot of the East Asian countries are starting to look at other East Asian countries as their markets, and less the US and Europe. And that's a really, really important dynamic. It's something that is going under the radar, but actually your question addressed precisely that phenomena. And by the time the West realizes it, it's actually going to be too late. That it's actually going to create this very alternate force in the global economy with less and less reliance on Western markets. And when later we discuss Sri Lanka, this is also something which is extremely important for countries like Sri Lanka and other aspiring developing countries.
Howard, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The West hasn't been keeping up, because I think if you go back 20 years and you talked about China, we'd be speaking in terms of its dependence on the US economy, on the US consumer to sustain its production powerhouse. But that's not the case anymore, right? It's mostly in Southeast Asia now. Over the last 20 years, it's shifted.
Which actually explains why it is that China has won this tariff war. US is far more dependent on China and the supply chains that China dominates than China is dependent on the US. Basically, in any case, they had to go back on a lot of the tariffs because they were affecting American companies producing in China and exporting to the United States. But more importantly, as you said, the world has changed over the last 20 years. The Chinese are far less dependent. Of course, they're affected. There's no doubt they'll be affected. But who is going to be affected more? Is it China or is it the US? And is this situation actually accelerating China's global dominance? And that, I think, is what we have now seen from this tariff war and the end consequences of the tariff war, that I think no matter how the US tried to spin it, basically the US Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary of State, chased the Chinese delegation to Switzerland and literally begged them for a deal. And I think that's not conspiracy theory. It's actually an open secret. They were desperate because the damage being inflicted on the US economy was so great, and China was sitting there with all the cards in their hand. And that is basically because China has slowly, without much fanfare, created this alternate ecosystem. And the Europeans are also starting to realize this. The Europeans are also going to China and starting to talk to them again. Having said, no, we're going to isolate China and so on. I mean, the only thing that may have worked is if the US and Europeans and their allies tried to work together to isolate China, but that's not so easy. It's not the one country. China is now part of a larger network where the markets that they're accessing are not controlled by either the US or the Europeans.
I think the funny thing there is that it's not even that the Chinese have to sort of do some hard negotiating with the US government or European governments for that matter, but you see American and European companies actually fighting on China's behalf because they all know they're screwed without China, you know, and that's partly because their supply chains are just, you know, spread out over China and so dependent on production in China that they'd immediately sink if that were to be jeopardized. So you got companies like Apple that would have, well, we even saw that immediately started telling the US government, look, are you serious? You're going to start this tariff war, not with China, but you're actually starting it with us. You're damaging our profits. You know, and that's why that exemption immediately came for Apple and a couple of other US companies. But do you remember that also it was the ASML boss, ASML being the Dutch company producing these machines that make the semiconductors, and they basically have a monopoly in
lithography.
That's right, yeah. He was the one that said, actually, this is totally foolish to impose these sanctions on China, banning us from exporting our machines there. Because, first of all, it's a market we can't be excluded from. We need to be in there if we want to have any sort of future. But second of all, he says this is only going to spur the development of their own domestic capabilities to produce our types of machines. And they'll get there even faster. And you get the CEO of NVIDIA effectively saying the same thing. I think he said it a couple of weeks ago, where it's total stupidity to try and ban the export of these advanced GPUs and chips that NVIDIA produces to China, because he said the same thing, you know, it's just going to make them even get there even faster to producing their own chips that have similar technological capabilities. And he knows he needs that market, you know, in the long run and in the short run for that matter. He needs that market. So it's so funny how now, like you said, China just has to sit there and wait. They don't even have to negotiate because the pain is being inflicted on US companies, but also the US consumer. Because remember, if all of this had, if all the tariffs had stayed in effect, you're dealing with a US population that has already suffered through massive inflation. Everyone's number one complaint with the last election was prices having risen too much and that they can't afford simple things anymore. And then on the back of that, you're going to introduce this tariff war, which is going to push costs and prices up even more for the US consumer. I mean, can you imagine what would have happened? The pressure on the US government to immediately abandon that would have been so great, and perhaps was so great that they, you know, gave it up after a couple of weeks.
Trump has managed to reduce the price of eggs in America. Let's give him some credit. But absolutely agree with you, Bram and Howard, because I think the latest data from China shows that they've managed to mitigate the initial impacts of the tariff war merely through domestic consumption. And this is the benefit of the policy over the last 20 odd years, where they addressed the poverty in their own population, right? And they brought up the bottom 10, 20%. today where they can step in and help boost domestic consumption to the extent where it can step in and absorb some of the production. Now, both of you guys have been in China very recently. Would you agree with that? I think some of the data indicates that this is where China is going, or maybe it's its plan B. But it's certainly something that's powerful, which it still has up its own sleeve, right?
Well, it's always been there, Sean, always that possibility that China could substitute US market with its own domestic market if the government runs an adventurous enough fiscal policy. Chinese are very cautious, though. They do not want to blow their economy and make it in a way like the American economy that is reliant on debt. What they've experienced this collapse of housing, and that created tremendous problems for them, and they've more or less dealt with it now, and there's even a recovery in the property sector in China. But they're very conservative in their policies. They're definitely increasing domestic demand, but they're doing it quite selectively. And interestingly, there was one BBC documentary recently about, and I think they titled it called The Silver Train. And silver being the Chinese government encouraging old people to spend more. I think they subsidize their trips on these high-speed trains to rural areas. And they wanted to make it more attractive for their own population to spend money going on holiday in the rural areas so that they benefited because they had holidays, but they benefited the rural areas. They encouraged the local economy there. And I was amazed that the BBC had this documentary, because normally it's very anti-Chinese whenever it makes any documentary on China. But they were showing, these trains full of, and they call it silver train because, like me, they all had gray hair. So you see all these gray-haired people and, very luxurious trains to give them an incentive to travel with, sleeping compartments, luxurious sleeping compartments and so on, but all heading into the interior of the country. And the idea was that they would give a stimulus to those parts of the economy. And they've done similar things, like forced a lot of the owners of these huge condominiums that were built, which were never occupied. They're forcing them to actually start selling them to low-income families. Again, providing incentives and subsidies. But their idea is also to have, let's say, a more equitable distribution of wealth and income.
Absolutely.
In raising living standards, so they don't go for, let's say, lower interest rates per se, which actually benefit a lot of rich people, but rather what they're trying to do is to use this opportunity to transfer more income from the rich to the poorer sections while boosting aggregate
consumption
output in the
and rural economy. Sounds like another tick for the planned economy approach. They seem to be getting it right with this approach.
Exactly.
What you said earlier about maybe 15 years ago, when the Chinese government encouraged the private sector to go out there and set up in other countries, we noticed that ourselves, working in this part of the world, in Sri Lanka, for example, where the number of Chinese companies were looking to come and set up was probably at an all-time high about 12 years ago. And it might have kind of marginally tapered off over the more recent years. So the whole idea or the concept of the Western capitalist superiority as a system has very seriously been undermined, right? And I refer to some of our previous discussions about how the Chinese form of capitalism tends to lend itself to fostering a competitive environment, whereas what we've seen in the West has been greater and greater monopoly, oligopoly, etc., where people just had, fatter and fatter profit margins and at the expense of competition, true competition in the textbook form of what capitalism should be, if it is indeed to benefit people through innovation, etc. And here in real time, we're seeing how the very deformed type of capitalism that we've witnessed has actually resulted in certainly loss to the people. I feel living standards in the West have suffered because, the telecom companies, the utilities companies, which are privatized, huge mistake that people are realizing now, have all resulted in a net decrease in the living standards for most people in the West. Techno-feudalism, I think, is a book by Professor Yanis, who's taken it to the next level to show how the oligarchs control things. Whereas the Chinese are, I suppose there's only one boss in town, and that's the people's, the government arm, and then the Chinese Communist Party, rather. And then, but they are doing a great job in getting everyone to compete, the private sector, and innovate. Maybe this is something which is a lesson for the countries that we're looking at in the emerging economies world.
That leads me to a very interesting observation made by Joseph Stiglitz, Professor Stiglitz. He noted the emphasis in the US on military expenditure. And recently we had President Trump boasting about the first $1 trillion allocation for military expenditure. The Europeans are doing the same. He also noted that in contrast, the Chinese budget for education is 3 times as large as their military budget. Whereas in the US, the military budget is 4 times as large as the education budget, you see. But there's another important aspect of military expenditure for Europe and for the US. Now, remember, Europe is now attempting to lift itself out of the doldrums by military expenditure. One important thing about military expenditure is there's no competition. Okay, there are no open bids. It's nearly always done according to which company receives favor from the Pentagon or the European Union president or whoever. Okay, so there's no competition. Whereas what we know, and which has been vital for innovation in China, is competition. Even when China protected certain sectors with tariffs, what they did was they encouraged fierce bloodletting amongst Chinese companies in that sector. So they promoted lots of these companies, they gave them a lot of credit and a lot of support. But what they did is once they reached a certain size, they pulled the rug. And they said, okay, now you're on your own, fight it out. Because it's competition that they were really after. Now, isn't that funny to think this is Chinese Communist Party emphasizing capitalist competition? But that is precisely the Chinese model. This is what has driven innovation. And here, you see, now that the Europeans and US have committed themselves to go down this road of spending the most amount of money in the least competitive industries and sectors, what chance do they have to catch up in terms of innovation? They don't have much of a chance. Just look at Boeing. All the money that has been thrown at Boeing in a non-competitive bidding environment. Look at Boeing. I mean, most people don't want to travel on Boeing planes anymore because they're extremely worried those things will not make it to their destination. And actually, I'm serious about that. I've been on planes where people are even talking about it. Are we on one of those 737 Maxes? Haven't they crashed all over the place? I mean, can they even take off? And that is something that Boeing can't actually fix in the short term because they've never had to be that competitive. Even their supposed rivalry with Airbus, it's a controlled competition. It's not like what the Chinese are encouraging. I guarantee you that soon even the aircraft industry is going to be incredibly competitive in China. Not just that they're competing with Airbus and Boeing, but you'll see other Chinese companies coming up.
Actually, Howard, absolutely. In the interest of time, we have to move to South Asia, but I can't avoid the temptation. So I just want to show you that the Chinese are winning the social media war as well. If Niflan can put that slide, because we did a primary research into the social media landscape in Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And you will see here that, and this one I believe is for the Maldives, we see that TikTok has come up very fast, very quickly. And this year, it will most likely be the most popular social media platform in the Maldives and Sri Lanka as well. And one thing that wasn't even in our questionnaire, which I think will be of interest to all of us here, wasn't even our questionnaire because we thought it was so fringe, was this app here, Telegram, which I think you'll remember came up particularly strong during the COVID years when the trust level with these oligarch-owned mainstream platforms diminished as they refused to put anything critical of the COVID vaccine. And then, so Telegram is huge at the moment and it's still growing. So, we know that this is from Q1 this year, but we know that the growth rate here is the strongest, which probably means that when we do this again in Q1 2026, we will see TikTok topping the charts for the social media war as well. Not personally a fan of many of these at all, but I'm just putting it out there as most people are. Right, thanks, Niflan. Right, sir. I think the next question that has to be answered is: does India have a chance to replace China as maybe the preferred destination for the big players, the multinationals? I read this morning that I think Apple is proactively trying to relocate from China to India. I mean, is this plausible? Is it something that can be achieved, or is it something to think about maybe as a long-term trend, which might see? And I think this is also a big problem with the BRICS that we have. BRICS is great at opposing what BRICS and everyone else, or most of the global South, strongly disagree with, but in terms of getting the I and the C to agree, is fundamentally problematic because they are in a very competitive setting, geopolitically, but also economically. So I'll turn to Howard and then Brahm to get your views on if you feel that India is a viable alternative to China in the eyes of the Western multinationals. Who'd like to go first?
Brahm, you are the one that has the strongest views on this.
I mean, it's been such a popular topic of discussion, right? That India has, I think, now recently surpassed Japan to become the fourth largest economy in the world. So that got a lot of people excited. And I have to say from the start that the sense I'm getting from statistics and people on the ground in India and several states that truly something has happened over the past 10 years at least, where living standards have risen and India has managed to modernize in a couple of areas, particularly, I think, electronic payments and some other aspects of the economy. But this is where we have to now bring in context as well, where what we're talking about really is when we talk of China, it's no longer a discussion of where they're going to rank or where they currently rank as the largest economy in the world. That ship has sailed. China is either already the biggest by some measures. So if you take something called purchasing power parity, China is already the largest economy in the world. But the point really is that you have a population there that is at least 3 times the size of that of the US, I think almost 4. And their per capita income is just going to keep rising and rising relative to that of the US. And what we are talking about is really a China that I think in the next 30 years will manage to catch up to the US in per capita income terms. And actually already now, I think people don't realize that the whole east coast of China, you're talking of the areas around Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and taken all together, you have a population there of 120 million people that are actually as wealthy as their South Korean neighbors. And that's something that people, I don't think, fully realize, that this is already a country that is approaching advanced country levels of per capita income. And if we compare that to what India is doing, sure, per capita incomes are rising, but it's not catching up to China. It's not going to do that anytime soon. And even if it does start doing that, it's going to take a long, long time to get anywhere near China, because China has built up such a massive lead. And this is, again, coming back to our core of the analysis, is China's manufacturing prowess. That they have advanced in so many areas technologically by having the correct policies in place for over 30 years and created such a competitive environment, not just among Chinese companies, but remember, foreign companies have been in there for such a long time and now are embedded in the supply chains in China as well. To replicate all of that in India is such a massive undertaking that even if they start doing the right thing now, they're going to be 20 years behind. And so by the time India would manage to catch up to China, I think you're talking about 50 years, maybe longer, if they even manage to do it. Because at the moment, if we look at India, I'm not seeing the type of data that made us so optimistic about China 20 years ago, where manufacturing really has the focus, even though Modi has now increasingly said that India needs to industrialize, and contrary to what they thought before, the services-led approach is not doing enough for India. So even though that is recognized among Indian policymakers, I think there's either the inability or unwillingness to do what China did, which is really aggressively go for manufacturing, get foreign companies to come and produce there, start joint ventures with Indian companies, start promoting competition in all manner of manufacturing areas in India. And their problem actually is now, see, when China started doing this, you're talking of a global context where, as JD Vance said, a lot of US and European companies were actually looking to shift their production out of their own countries and into anyone that would offer them all these benefits. And there was no country that was on the rise like China is now. India has that problem now, where they're going to immediately, from the word go, have to compete with all these Chinese companies that are madly innovating and becoming more and more productive, pushing down their costs of production. And so that's why what you see in India is a very, the successful companies there are basically monopolies. They're protected by the state in a lot of the areas they operate. And they're generally not competitive when it comes to, the manufacturing areas that matter. And this is going to be India's problem going forward, where I don't think they can do anything anytime soon to start catching up with China. But even if they do, it's going to take such a long time to make a dent.
Thanks, Bram. And I don't think India's done half as much as China to alleviate the bottom deciles of the lowest income groups either, right? So, Howard, what would be your take? Would you agree with Bram on the fact that India is behind?
Howard, you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes. Just to add, a very interesting piece of data you sent, I forget to which chat group you sent it from, but the number of large companies, comparing the number of large companies in China and in India. And actually, the number of large companies in India was far greater than the number of large companies in China, which actually tells that story that you were telling, and that is that India is dominated by monopolies. And it's that domination that actually inhibits innovation and technology change. So, that's not a very sound basis to start from if you're going to go down this technologically based manufacturing path that we're talking about. That's the only thing I had to say. Roshan, now, in order to get back to also another thing that you wanted us to discuss, but much earlier, and that is our forecast of global recession. I think that's where, if I can ask Bram to do that, with the global business cycles, the long business cycle and the shorter business cycle, Bram, just in brief, to show people where we are and why we're actually thinking like this, and then its significance for, we're particularly concerned about Sri Lanka, of course, but it has a significance for developing countries in general, but Sri Lanka in particular. So if you can just very briefly tell us where you see us at this moment in those cyclical terms, and then we can go to Sri Lanka on that basis.
Talk very briefly about the long and short cycles. Sure, I'll do that.
Spend a bit more time on the short ones.
Well, the long one will actually can be very short, because essentially what it is so what theoretical framework that we work with is something called the Kondratyev wave. And that's basically a 50 to 70 year cycle, but it can vary, a long-term cycle that keeps recurring. And what you're essentially seeing now, so all the things we've discussed in this podcast are things that really characterize the bottom of that long cycle. And so I have it here where I did a bit of an illustration. It's so similar to the last long cycle bottom that we saw during the Great Depression and the First and Second World Wars in the 30s and 40s, where we're seeing this rise of protectionism and other methods of economic warfare, because essentially the old economic powers are on their way down, and they're trying to retain some of the power that they still have by attempting to block the new powers that are rising. And there's a scramble basically for retaining living standards for their domestic population. So we see that in every long cycle down, there's an increased tendency for protectionism. And often that has escalated to military conflicts as well. Hence, you got the First and Second World Wars, where, of course, this is not to deny the rise of Nazism in Germany, but to say that a lot of that, which is even recognized, had to do with the way that Germany was suppressed before and after the First World Wars. What Howard was talking about, cutting off their supply of raw materials, and the same with Japan. And the third thing that I put in there is this tendency of governments to not only turn protectionists and turn their weapons on other countries, but to basically use government spending to try and prop up their own economies. And so this is what we've seen over the last 25 years, is every recession that you see in this chart, so the shaded areas, we've seen higher and higher budget deficits because there's been an increasing need with increasingly weaker economies to prop them up through government spending. And so COVID was the biggest that we've seen up to now, and very similar to the massive budget deficit in the 40s. And the question is now whether we've actually reached the very bottom of this long cycle and are ready to see economies grow again without this life support. We don't think so, because typically what should happen at the bottom of this long cycle is quite a lot of asset destruction, especially in the old economies, because it's basically clearing out the dead wood. There's a lot of unproductive companies, sometimes referred to as zombie companies. In other words, those companies that are basically not profitable anymore, but only surviving off of more and more credit. We see that tendency just keeps on rising in the advanced countries, and the more and more they delay this inevitable destruction of those companies, the worse the problem gets. And so until that happens, we would expect with the next recession probably an even bigger budget deficit if the governments of the advanced countries still have this policy of propping up their economies. But that's where we now ask the question with Trump is, are they still of that view? Because he has often said that actually he doesn't believe in that sort of government intervention. He wants to decrease spending. And, maybe when this next recession comes around, he'll be the first administration in a long time to actually say, okay, we just let this recession play out, clear out the deadwood, let all those companies that aren't strong enough to go out of business and, move on from there. And the implicit assumption here is, of course, that another recession is actually coming. And that's where our short cycle analysis comes in, where actually we know, because it's been recorded by the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research in the US, that there's over 200 years of data showing the short cycle again and again and again every 7 to 11 years. And that's why now we're actually expecting it to come around again quite soon, sooner than perhaps would normally be the case, because the economies are so weak. And because this inevitable destruction of assets has been delayed so much, it could come quite soon. And so now we're actually predicting that probably next year we're going to see weakness returning. And then the question for us is going to be, are we going to see a return of fiscal stimulus? Are governments in the advanced countries and perhaps in China going to say, right, let's do another COVID level injection into the economy to prop it up and keep it from basically having a 1930s style Great Depression? Because that's what you would be looking at if there was no intervention.
Thanks, Bram. Really fascinating and worrying, I would say. Probably the price of gold is rising as you speak. If we're expecting that around the next corner. We wanted to talk about industrialization, right? And Sri Lanka. And I think we have a little bit of time. And we have concerns about Sri Lanka in terms of its economic policy, as well as its overall lack of clarity, to want of a better word. So I'm going to give this one to Howard to kick off. What would be take, just to put a setting on it? I just spoke to a friend who works in the equity markets today, and he was just saying that there's been a huge exodus of foreign investment into the Colombo Stock Exchange in the last couple of months. And yesterday I was reading in the papers that 4.6 million in one day was dumped by foreigners in the bond market as well. So there seems to be a underlying lack of confidence on the part of foreign investors on Sri Lanka, at least in the bond and equity markets. And we don't really see a massive amount of FDI coming in. There have been many voices critical of the government. I personally believe it's still early, and they haven't had a full crack. But what's your view, Howard? Where do you think we're going here?
I think you're right. It's early days, Roshan, but we have been arguing something now for quite some time. And unfortunately, it's coming to pass. And that is, following IMF policies has always led to a disaster for all countries. I mean, I can't even think of exceptions. It's always led to a disaster. But unfortunately, in this case, it's not simply that we have followed IMF policies, but we have followed extreme neoliberal policies. We are one of the first countries in the world to have passed legislation preventing the central bank from buying government debt in the primary market or even the secondary market. This means that without any shadow of a doubt, Sri Lanka is stuck with very high interest rates. I don't mean the nominal level, I mean the real level. That is when you take the nominal interest rate relative to inflation. Now, at the moment, it's 7.5%, and inflation is minus 2%. That gives us 9.5% in a situation of considerable weakness in the economy, especially in the manufacturing sector. This means the cost of funds, especially working capital, is excessive in Sri Lanka. We are behaving as if this is one of the strongest economies in the world, where we can actually afford these excessive levels of interest. The only beneficiaries of this short term are the banks. But long term, they too will suffer. As you've just said, you can see the stock market is not buying it. And this is one of the things that the government should have solved at a very early stage. They should have amended the Central Bank Act, but they didn't. And they didn't because they're under pressure from the IMF and the US government. Why we should allow foreign entities to dictate to us something like this is beyond me. We have abrogated our independence and therefore our well-being for kudos from the US and the IMF. This is absurd. Unless they're going to come with a massive aid package and say, okay, guys, here, we're going to pay off your debt. We're going to hand over lots of money for you for fixed capital formation. Don't worry about anything. We've got your back. We're not saying anything like that. And it's not going to happen anyway. So it's very difficult for me to understand why we have still this policy, which then is compounded by a second problem. We have one of the most overvalued currencies in the world. In the world. And when we say overvalued, so there is Brahm showing the overvalued currency. And this overvaluation actually has been there for some time. Indeed, from about 2016, we can see that it was overvalued. IMF has commented on it, ironically, only until they put the agreement together with Sri Lanka. Then it stopped commenting on it. But when you read any IMF report on why Sri Lanka had a currency crisis, one of the things you see immediately is overvalued currency. So look at January 2022. They keep referring to that, but look at January 2025. Look at how overvalued we are now. But they don't mention this. That should be in every single report they write. Hang on, guys. You've really let the ship go down. Okay, but they don't say that. Do you have the chart on the real interest rates as well, Bram? Okay, this is to compare Sri Lanka's real interest rate with a number of other countries. Can you see we're at the top there? We're the highest real interest rate. So they say there are two prices that affect all economies. The entire economy. One, interest rates. Two, exchange rate. You could barely survive if you get one wrong. But you can't survive when you get two wrong. It's just a matter of time before the system collapses and implodes. And this is our problem at the moment. If we're headed towards a global recession, this is going to be the day of reckoning. And in Sri Lanka's case, remember, it's not just a situation of normality. By 2028, we're going to have to start repaying this onerous debt. which we've agreed to repay without any renegotiation, anything. I mean, that's why I say, has the US promised to repay our debt for us? Has the IMF promised to secure sources of financing to alleviate the burden of that debt? I don't see it. The government hasn't announced anything. So why would anyone be invested in Sri Lanka when it's an accident waiting to happen? I just don't get it as things stand. I mean, what we know is that from 2026 onwards, the clock is ticking. So the recession couldn't come at a worse time, because it'll hit us full force in 2027, the year just before we start repaying our debt. Can we accumulate reserves in the middle of a global recession? Is Sri Lanka the first country to defy gravity?
Elon Musk thinks so, I think.
I think so. But one other bad piece of news this last week was the closure of a big garments factory in Katunayake by the British company Next. I think there were some 1,400
jobs.
So,
and they've been here since 1978 or 75, right?
Right. I mean, it's not only government policies, obviously. It has something to do with tariffs and restructuring of supply chains and so on and so forth. But I don't see this present environment, high real interest rates, overvalued currency, etc., being conducive to foreign investors, or let alone foreign investors, local investors, because they're the ones saddled with the high interest rates. And we already had an SME problem before this. SMEs have been crying because of Pareto execution, etc., etc. I mean, they're in trouble. Our SME sector is in deep, deep trouble. And that is the dynamic heart of any developing country. I don't see.
I have some data for you, Howard, on the SME sector. So it accounts for 52% of GDP in Sri Lanka and 4.5 million jobs, and accounts for 76% of all companies. And if you go back to 2018, the SMEs accounted for 58 billion towards GDP, and the NPL ratio was 3.4. We now roll the clock forward to 2022, 38 billion contributions have fallen by 10 billion in just 4 years, and NPL rate is 36%. And I'll just give you an example from the construction sector. Whilst the big boys, the ones that are blue chip companies, were able to withstand a pause of 1 year, up to 1 year where there was no projects, no income, all the SMEs in the construction sector just had to fall, because there's no way you can sustain your workforce over such a period. And unfortunately, we keep seeing this trend. It hasn't gone away. I mean, we see small companies closing literally every day. People I know personally closing up or downsizing. So whilst I agree with you, it's not music to our ears by any means. It's quite worrying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, an NPL of 36% is huge.
Exactly. I think this is the most important number. I mean, I didn't know this until you just said it, and you were quoting 2022. One would hope that that situation has improved somewhat since 2022, but I'm guessing it's nowhere near returning to normalcy.
No, that's right. The Federation of SMEs in Sri Lanka is literally screaming for the government to look at the needs of the SMEs, which I don't think the IMF have at all, right?
Yeah.
It's completely been overlooked.
No, I think this is important. I don't know if Bram wanted to add something, because it's your data, Bram, on the manufacturing, industrial production.
No, we just had that data for overall production up to March 2025, where indeed there has been a bit of a recovery, as you would expect, since the collapse in 2022. But, still we're talking of levels that are like 20% below their peak in 2015. That's when the peak was. So you're talking of 10 years of basically no growth. And we know that the manufacturing sector and the industrial sector are the beating heart of any economy. So how Sri Lanka is supposed to sustain any sort of growth with basically a contraction in the manufacturing and industrial sectors is beyond me. And well, you see how it's being done. It's again back to services like tourism and IT and a couple of others in there, which are not sustainable. We know that. And, it doesn't have the same dynamism as manufacturing, unreliable. And, never ever has it really raised the living standards, even within that sector, for the people that work there. Only way that happens is if the country actually develops through a manufacturing-driven growth. And so, again, this is such a worry going forward, not just in terms of growth, but also the foreign exchange earnings that are now again heavily reliant on tourism and I guess also remittances, foreign remittances. But yeah, we all know where that led the last time, and nothing has changed.
I have some data for you, bro. This time from Bangladesh. Niflan, can we get it up? Volume and growth rate of the manufacturing sector. You love this. Just to show you that Sri Lanka should maybe look at doing something different. Here you can see the large companies in manufacturing were growing consistently with the overall growth rates, whereas the SMEs and even the cottage industries were doing great, except for the fact that, and something I think we all know, COVID had a devastating effect on the SME sector. You can see that in Bangladesh, I think in Sri Lanka and everywhere else. But then in Bangladesh, there's a somewhat of a recovery. It's gone up to 6.8% in the latest data from a low of 4.8 for the SME sector. So, but by contrast, the big guys increased their share during the COVID years, which again was a global trend. I don't think we couldn't find these matching data for Sri Lanka. I'm still working on it, but I'd be very surprised to see a similar pattern. So I think we need to learn from our neighboring countries. I was there recently, and in one of our surveys, one of the criteria or the risks that people foresaw in the leaders of industry was more to do with domestic policy, domestic unemployment, and they were less reliant on what happened in the world. Of course, they're a large country, 10 times the size of Sri Lanka almost, and they can rely on their own consumer markets and domestic demand. But at the same time, they have an amazing set of policies for companies, either local or foreign, to come set up in their free trade zones. Something that Sri Lanka, pursued with a lot of energy back a couple of decades ago, which seems to have tapered off. Thanks, Niflan. I think we run out of time almost, but over to you, Howard, for your thoughts on that.
No, thanks for that data. That's interesting. I just, it makes me more depressed. In fact, Roshan, just one thing to mention in the Sri Lankan context, I constantly read things like, other countries have gone down this manufacturing path, and okay, that has yielded benefits and so on. But we may be the first country to achieve development using a different strategy. I mean, how many times have you heard this? I think I've heard it once every few years over the last 40 years of working in Sri Lanka. This time it's going to be different. This time, all we need to do is control corruption. So this I hear all the time. Develop our agricultural sector, which is okay, that's what should happen, and rely on tourism and remittances, and then we'll be okay. Everything will be okay. It's this wishful thinking which is actually expressed by Sri Lanka's business community as well. Or let's put it this way, by representatives of the business community trying to carry favor with government and whoever, as if they are involved in some great marketing project of Sri Lanka. If only we instill confidence in foreigners, they'll come in droves. This is the sort of attitude that is really worrying. Where, don't worry. It's actually, everything is under control. We're going to do something in agricultural sector and maybe some services sector and so on and so forth. But it'll all turn out okay. And if it doesn't turn out okay, then we can't help it because we never expected a global recession. We're always going to find this one excuse, this time it was COVID before, it's the global recession next, it was corruption of the Rajapaksas, and it goes on endlessly, it's always some excuse or another.
And if only those hadn't come along, we would have been the richest country in the world by now.
Exactly.
Then we did take the choice to liberalize and become globalized. So, hey guys, that part of that is to watch the world and have a surveillance on what's happening and listen to Howard Nicholas, which they're not doing, and Brahm now increasingly. Well, Brahm, would you like to add anything? Because I think our 1 hour podcast is just 9 minutes shy of 2 hours.
It was the long cycle part that pushed it over the edge, I think.
Exactly.
No, I mean, I can't help but still think about what Howard said as well, where that is the worry, that it's the same old optimism that, I mean, and the thing is, what I'm also hearing is this increasing focus on sort of like buzzwords, where we now do inclusive growth and we focus on the environment. So we set up an entire ministry to deal with climate change and things like that. And there's no one left really that is actually interested in developing the economy, because they're all focused on sort of these fringe things where it's not to say that they're not important, but I can also guarantee you that one of the first things that's going to be slashed is a budget on dealing with climate change when the recession comes. And, in the end, we need to really get serious about the fundamentals. And I think that is lost with all these buzzwords that are floating around and have preoccupied Sri Lanka's economists, while they're no longer focused on how to actually grow Sri Lanka and deal with the problems we know are the most important. Where are the foreign exchange earnings? We keep coming back to it again and again and again, and it seems to be forgotten every single time. Even though you think the lesson had been learned by now, you have a foreign debt crisis. 2 days later, economists are talking about domestic debt. And you're thinking, what is going on there? If you haven't figured out the problem by now, I don't know when that's going to happen.
Bram, there's something even more worrying around the corner because I think Sri Lanka is sending a representative to the US to see what America wants in return for tariff normalization. And my feeling has always been that Sri Lanka's greatest gift or blessing is its location, its maritime advantages. It's a massive thorn in the plans of Indian plans to expand its port activity just because Sri Lanka is there. I really hope that we don't give away something very cheaply for a short-term gain when our medium and long-term interests would be much better served with a more cautious approach to that negotiation. I think we'll have to come back to it maybe in a week or two when we'll know more. But I think we know that we haven't had a great record of dealing with the US. And the feedback we're getting now is the government is lacking this capacity for people having them on their side to bat for them, as it were, on a way that they don't get, intellectually bullied by the IMF, the World Bank, and people in Washington, etc. So we have very serious concerns about that. I think it's coming up in the next few weeks, and something that we will have to watch closely, I believe. All right. And thanks for that Vines clip, Bram. It's really good. It just makes you wonder what all those development institutions who've been telling us a certain narrative and to globalize and follow the narrative, where does that leave them now? Will they change their tune? We'll come back to that next time as well, hopefully. Big thank you to Professor Howard Nicholas and Dr. Bram Nicholas, for both of you, for the contribution, and hope to see you again really soon. Safe travels in Vietnam, and all the best.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone listening.